Welcome to the Humble Hoof podcast. My name is Alicia Harlov. This is a podcast for both horse owners and hoof care professionals, offering discussions into various philosophies on the health of the hoof and soundness of your horse. Please check us out on Facebook or at thehumblehoof.com.
Trying to choose the right supplements for the right horses often feels like a chore, and you have enough chores as it is. Fortunately, there's Equithrive, whose mission is to make this whole nutrition equation easier on you and much more beneficial to your horses. Equithrive's lineup of pelleted supplements are developed with care, backed by science, and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Not to mention picky eater approved. Whether you need advanced joint care for your equine athlete, gut, or metabolic support, Equithrive is your one-stop shop for feed tub fortification. Do your horses and yourself a favor and visit equithrive.com. Use the promo code HumbleHoof and get 20% off your first order, plus free and fast shipping nationwide. Don't forget to use HumbleHoof, all one word, to get 20% off your first order at equithrive.com.
A special thank you to our wonderful sponsor, Cavallo. For our Humble Hoof listeners, they are offering 20% off their Cavallo Trek hoof boots using the coupon code HRN at checkout. The Trek is the world's most popular and versatile hoof boot and Cavallo's toughest trail boot, while also doubling as an option for therapy or rehab. The front closure system makes it easily adaptable to various hoof shapes, and the TPU upper design allows for maximum strength while minimizing weight for the comfort and ease of movement for your horse. These are recommended by vets and trainers and also loved as transport boots by barrel racers, show jumpers, dressage riders, and everyone in between. Again, for 20% off a pair of Treks, use the code HRN at checkout at cavallo-inc.com. Every single year around April or the start of spring, I have horses that start coming up sore, quote unquote, out of nowhere. And I have owners that are freaking out, wondering if it's the trim or if their horse suddenly needs more hoof protection or shoes, or if their horse just randomly decided that it couldn't handle the ground that it was walking over just fine a month ago. Something that I try to educate on is the dangers that come along with seasonal changes, whether that be the spring right now in the northern hemisphere or the fall right now in the southern hemisphere. Two of my hoof care friends, Kristen Wertz and Rosemary Zwanenburg, agreed to chat with me very last minute and discussed some of the issues that we see in horses that are out on spring grass or dealing with some of these seasonal changes and what we can do to not only treat it once we're seeing it, but prevent it before it ever happens. Cool. And so I know, Kristen, have you been on the podcast before?
No, I haven't.
Okay, cool. So do you want to give a little information about, your business, like where you work from, like what you focus on, that kind of thing?
My name is Kristen Wertz. I've been involved with hoof care for about 3 years. I became involved to take care of my own horses and planned to only be taking care of them. And now I'm an accidental farrier. I pulled that phrase from someone else. It was genius.
That is fantastic. I feel like so many of us started that way.
We are all accidental.
We are all accidental farriers. That is correct.
Yeah.
I work in Dallas, Fort Worth. I have about a 2-hour zone all the way around the Metroplex. I compete in eventing and pure dressage, so the basis of my clientele are within those performance horses because I was already ingrained with that entire community.
Yeah.
Cool. Also, God bless you for doing performance horses because not me, sister.
It's not easy. Definitely not easy.
I know, especially keeping them comfortable and performing up to the level that they need to be. I do not do that as well.
Yeah, well, and often we have to band-aid a few things for a few months until we are on the off season where we can give the horses a break and work on some hoof rehab. So that is definitely fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding.
And Rose, I know that you've been on the podcast before, but it's been a little bit. So do you want to give a little bit of an update of where you are in your business and what your focus is now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not much has changed except for just like time. but I still am in Nova Scotia, living, working here. I mean, I know I just said I don't do any performance horses. I do some, but like I would say the big focus of my practice is like I do a lot of rehab, and then I do a lot of working horses. But I guess the distinction that I would make is that like I don't do a ton of horses who are actively competing and showing because I find it very stressful. But I do I do a ton of rehab, not focused on any one particular thing. I do have like a little bit of a special love for the heel pain navicular horses because I've owned so many in my life. But we also, in our area, we don't have a ton of laminitis expertise. So I've gotten, I've kind of fallen into that over the last little while, and it is stressful and scary, but I really like it. It's fun to help those horses, and it's very relevant for our episode and this time of year.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like so many of us get into this profession because of a horse, like we were talking about, like some issue, whether it's like navicular or whatever, some problem. And then all of us, like I, just like you, love working on navicular horses, but I feel like so much of my practice is laminitis cases because it's just so prevalent. And
so many horses have like maybe they're diagnosed navicular and maybe they have like caudal hoof problems, but it turns out the acute pain or what was actually being noticed is a laminitic issue.
It's like they all have laminitis on top of other diagnoses.
Right, exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Like we see so many horses here that are just like they struggle to hold on to any depth, so they have back of the foot problems, but then also whoopsie, they're like metabolic or they're just gorging themselves on sugar, so they also have front of the foot problems, and it's not good.
right.
And you can tell on the radiographs that their corium is always inflamed. I see so many radiographs where everything looks okay from a joint perspective, but then the corium is just very, very angry.
Totally. Or like, they've got those we're talking about, I know we're just kind of diving in haphazard, but some of those more subtle signs, like they have the angry hairs on their coronary band, or just their foot is like serumy all the time, like it's just yellow, and you're like, well, that's not good. Like that's not a healthy, happy foot.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess that's like a good segue into, focusing on what could go wrong this time of year. And obviously we're in the Northern Hemisphere, so I apologize for people that have a different climate this time of year. But honestly, I mean, we're heading into spring and the Southern Hemisphere is heading into fall, which also is kind of like a danger zone.
Totally. Yeah.
So, I don't know if all owners are aware of the risks of this time of year. And so that's something I kind of want to focus on. So something that I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this too, but something that I often hear complaints of from owners this time of year is, oh, my horse was a little foot sore or a little bit ouchy recently when I tried to take them on a trail, or like, oh, after their last trim, they were like a little bit ouchy, and normally they're totally fine and comfortable after a trim. And that to me is often one of the very first signs in between a cycle, like if I haven't seen anything yet in the hoof, that there's a warning sign that something needs to change and we need to kind of address what's going on with their diet.
I find it's really difficult for us as well if we work on a foot that's teetering on the edge of being laminitic, and then we come in and we do our trim. It's no different than it has been every single month for the last however many years, and then the horse is sore. And because it happened right after we were there, then often metabolic issues were overlooked. When what we did was we exacerbated the inflammatory aspect in the system that was already present.
Right, exactly. And so, Rose, you see kind of the same thing in terms of some of the complaints if there's a problem?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of, like you said, Alicia, it's like, oh, they're a little footy, or like, oh, they came in and they were a little sore over gravel, or they were just like, they seemed a little off, a little sticky, a little stiff, whatever. And I think like my directive has become to a lot of my clients, right, just like this time of year in particular, we should be thinking of any kind of change in their comfort as suspicious for laminitic issues. And, stiffness or stickiness or footiness, we can't just either dismiss it or, like you said, Kristen, be like, we just took them a little too short. It's like, well, no, they have the same trim that they've had, like you said, through the winter, through the fall. And if that trim is suddenly making them sore, and it's not to say like, yes, sometimes we might make like a little whoopsie, but most of us are going to know if we do or not. And if the same trim that's been keeping a horse comfortable for months is suddenly causing them to be sore, well, sure, it might have been the catalyst, but there's something else going on inside the foot that is causing, like, making it so that little change in balance is a challenge for the horse.
Right. Like that little shift in weight bearing is suddenly going to inflame some structures that were able to compensate when they were, moving around with the same foot for 5 weeks. And then suddenly there's a little change and, the inflammation's like, whoa, I need to, it's just not happy. I see the same thing. And I guess we kind of skipped over, and part of this is, Kristen and Rose and I just were like, let's hop on and talk about spring and hoof and hooves.
Yeah,
but I guess, something to address is like, why is this happening? And most often in my area, because there's so much grass turnout. I mean, not so much, obviously, it really depends on the barn, but that grass that was dead and dormant all winter is now that we're having temperatures consistently above freezing and we're having, rain and sun and those grass shoots are popping up. It's like, even though nibbling those little bits of grass is affecting their lamina, whether the horse is like actually metabolic, which if they're actually metabolic, take them off of grass. They should not be on any grass.
Yeah.
I also find issues with the PSSM2 horses.
Yeah, right.
So I work on so many thoroughbreds. And thank you, Mr. Prospector, for giving us all PSSM2 to deal with. But I work with a lot of thoroughbreds, and I can usually pick the ones out that are possible PSSM horses just because they have some issues bringing their legs back on the stand, bringing their legs forward on the stand. And then when we have the grass issue, just like metabolic horses, they suffer as well.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And so, it's even these horses that aren't, like, I have owners that tell me, well, they're not metabolic, so I don't understand what the problem is. And I think that even if your horse isn't metabolic, if they're at a healthy weight at the end of winter, I mean, even if they're not, like, even, horses that even aren't metabolic, if they're nibbling these super sugary shoots of grass, that's going to be a change to their system. And it's going to change, everything from their gut. So not necessarily like a metabolic response, almost like a gut response, or it can be, for me, for example, I'm not diabetic in any way, but when I have a ton of sugar, my joints freaking hurt. Like, I don't know why.
And my hands are crippled when I eat all of the yummy things. I wish I could eat cookies for every meal. Right. And I suffer mightily. I already have to go to sleep with compression gloves and braces, but when I eat sugar, my hands are so swollen and they want to be stuck in contracture.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be a metabolic horse, and that's something that I'm not sure that everybody understands.
Okay. One thing that we also missed that you tipped on, Alicia, but you said it so quickly, the gut. I think the microbiome in the gut are so important, and that's when the big changes happen in the gut, and I think it just sets the system off, and it's the same for us. And I think we're still in the process of learning how important that system is.
Yeah. Yeah. And Rose, what were you going to say?
Well, like you had mentioned, sort of, again, we're so good at glossing over what we're trying, just like getting right into the weeds of things. But this time of year, something that I often see is people, people are trying to do their due diligence and not throwing their horse out into this great big lush pasture, but I'll see people putting their horse out onto something that's just a little scrubby, and the logic follows. You say, okay, there's not very much grass. They're just going to have a little nibble, get them used to it. But in reality, I think it's one really important point for owners and caretakers to take away is short grass is stress grass. Short grass is grass that is trying to grow. And so its sugar production is just going to be bonkers compared to a more mature field. So this time of year, we see those shoots coming up, and we think, okay, fine. Well, I'll just put maybe that dry lot wasn't used over the winter, and there's a little bit of grass coming up, so you can go in there and nibble it down, and you'll get used to the grass that way. And in reality, that could be one of the worst things you could possibly do for a horse that is sensitive to sugar, or even one that isn't necessarily all that sensitive historically, but you think that you're giving them like a little snack, but you're really giving them like a full-on candy buffet.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like now maybe some owners that are listening have their heart rates are kind of going up a little bit of realizing like, oh, shoot, where my horse is might be contributing to some problems. And I have some owners who swear up and down that their horse is totally fine, but I'm noticing issues. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about some symptoms. And one thing that I think is easy for owners to see, because the hoof stuff, which I think we can definitely spend some time talking about, maybe it's easier for hoof care providers to pick out all the changes in the feet. But for something the owners can watch for, something I tell owners is like, if your horse is typically trotting and cantering around and you notice them spending more time walking, like that to me is a warning sign. And I know that doesn't sound crazy. Like, it's not like they're lame. They're just not moving at their normal speed. Or a horse that normally is, you know, coming up to you and has no issue, just like spinning around when you go to put them out. And they're turning just a little bit slower, not even like rocking back, not even looking gimpy, but they're just taking their time a little bit more. That to me is a warning sign. Like something, like their feet are not feeling how they usually, I mean, it could be something else, but that is something, if it's this time of year, that I'm looking for. I don't know if you guys have other stuff that you see when you're watching horses move, or what owners might be able to pick out.
No, that sounds right to me. Like, just, it's really just like being aware of what your horse normally is like. Like, are they normally like really fluid? Are they normally really forward? And are you finding really any change? And like, maybe, like you said, there might be something else to account for it. It's not like every single change is going to come down to, you know, spring grass issues, or, you know, hormonal issues or what have you. But just, you know, yes, if your horse is one that usually lazes around in the paddock or the field, well, fine. But if they're usually ripping around and they're slow or walking, you should probably think about why. Or one that I really like is a lot of farms that I work at and see, there are at least some areas of gravel. And if you have a horse that normally doesn't care and they just start to like skirt to the edge and stay on the grass, why is that? Like, if they don't usually care about clomping across the gravel, but this time you're bringing them in from the paddock and they want to stay on the edge or on the median where the grass has grown up, they're probably feeling something. And they might not look lame, they might not have an asymmetry in their gait, but they're telling you something about where they're choosing to spend their time.
Right.
I actually see bruising in the soles on shod horses this time of year. So that's something new. I think Texas is, in my area, we've really, we've had some severe global warming issues. And I didn't think of it as global warming until someone mentioned it on one of your previous podcasts. But last summer was brutally hot.
Yeah.
We had all summer long, I think the hottest I saw in my truck was 135.
Wow.
Fahrenheit, and our horses were becoming laminitic from heat stress at that time. So everything was dead all summer, really all through the fall. Everything was still dead. I didn't have any metabolic issues this fall because we didn't have any grass. There was nothing. Right. It was just our Texas burned up. So now we've had inches and inches and inches of rain. Right now, my back field is as tall as my knees, and I'm afraid to mow it. So I leave it because I do have 2 horses out on it. But now we're having trouble when we didn't in the fall. When the fall is usually when we have the seasonal rise. So what I had found this season is that if horses are coming in a little bit sore, when I pull their shoes off and trim them, their white line is purple.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And we could chalk that up to several things. Say toe first landings can cause the purple white line at the toe, but these are horses who never have bruising and suddenly they do.
Yeah.
I've had a couple where while I was there, I mentioned maybe let's buy some resveratrol and give that and see if that helps. And 2 horses in particular, they cleared up in a week.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
A week. They were not sore anymore. And these are non-metabolic horses.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, so similar, like looking at hoof issues, a lot of times I'll start to see horses that normally have a very nice tight white line have like a little bit of separation, or I can get my like hoof pick into the white line at the quarters, whereas before it was nice and tight. Or,
nice and tight.
Yeah. Or I don't know if you guys see this, but sometimes I'll come to a foot that I had just trimmed 5 weeks before that looked beautiful and healthy. And all of a sudden it's like their collateral grooves just like disappeared. It's like their foot just flattened out over.
Flattened out.
Yeah.
And then they have separation.
For sure. Yeah. And I don't know, like, I know Kristen, because you guys have, I mean, I know it's all up in the air and climate is bonkers everywhere, but I think on the whole, you guys still probably have much drier feet than Alicia and I would see typically.
Typically, we are very dry, but I have experienced East Coast feet for the last 3 months.
Yeah, they stink. And like, so a lot of my practice is just like horses who struggle with vertical depth and trying to keep them going. And like you said, Alicia, there'll be horses that, okay, they come through the winter and maybe they don't have perfect feet with perfect depth, but they're doing okay. And you come back for a trim after, whatever, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and you're like, I swear to God, there was a foot here before, and it's just gone.
Right.
And I think for owners, collateral grooves are something that they can keep an eyeball on too. So, for folks listening, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know what a collateral groove is, but if you don't, it's, the space right on either side of the frog that you typically are picking out with your hoof pick. And so if you're noticing like a change in depth of that, if they're getting shallower, then that's another sign to be like, okay, something's changing, something is changing, probably not for the better in your foot, and trying to investigate and see what's going on there.
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like a lot of times I have owners that will tell me, oh my goodness, like something's wrong with my horse's feet because these grooves are just so deep. And to me, I pick up the foot. I'm like, no, this is like a healthy depth. Like this is what we want, over winter when the foot actually like has good depth here. Or like horses that I've been rehabbing all summer, and then all of a sudden we get to gain some progress in the winter, and the owner's like, something's wrong, like you need to come out for a trim. And I'm like, no, you should want to see this like all year round. Now, granted, obviously there's like an unhealthy depth where if a horse is like neglected and their foot's like so overgrown and they have crazy retained sole, and that's totally different. Like hopefully the farrier would be able to recognize if there's just like, that. But I never have owners that complain about no collateral grooves because I don't know that they are aware that that's a problem. But I have had owners freak out about deep collateral grooves.
That's really good. Same thing where they're like, hang on, this looks really bad. And you're like, no, actually, let's pop out the champagne because finally you have some depth.
Right.
Just have to be more diligent about picking those feet so they don't become thrushy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And sorry.
Okay, so that was like stuff that horse owners can recognize. I think like we talked about gait changes and like changes in sort of chosen speed and where they put their feet. And I don't know, is there anything like I've tried to tell people like collateral groove depths, or just are you noticing white line separation? Is there anything else that you guys ask or like give a heads up to your owners to be looking out for as like signs of inflammation and laminitis?
Well, honestly, this isn't something that necessarily is like a sudden change in the spring. But if I have horses where they have white line disease or poor quality walls, I usually tell my owners that to me, that's a red flag of either like metabolic or diet issue, or they could be at risk for laminitis because we know that there's poor quality hoof. So something's affecting that.
Right.
Because a lot of people are, I've had people reach out that say, oh, my horse, I've had this happen a few times that owners, somebody's asked me, for a consult, and they say, my horse foundered because of white line disease. And while I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because obviously there's, especially if you do a big resection and you're totally changing the foot, maybe that happened. But I usually tell them that the white line disease is a symptom. So if your horse has like a wall quality issue, there's something internally probably already happening. So that's something too, where if you're like, man, my horse just has junk feet that won't hold shoes, or man, like my horse's feet just chip up and fall apart. Obviously, I'm talking about in a wet environment. In a dry environment, I'm sure there's a lot more chipping. But here it's, those horses that get, cracks and their feet just crumble and they have white line disease, that I'm thinking that their diet or the grass or something metabolic is affecting them.
Yeah, for sure.
Diet and frequent farrier visits.
Right.
Keep those chips down.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here, 100%. I really can't. It's almost impossible to go longer than 4 weeks here.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
This last month,
because how dry it is?
I was nipping off a centimeter of foot off of everybody on 4-week cycles this last month.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, for 1 week, our horses never stop moving. It doesn't become cold enough, so we don't have slow cycles in the winter here. And I think now, because of all of the rain, the feet are just growing like mad.
Yeah.
Oy.
Man, this year's been wild weather-wise.
It really has. Yeah, we got another 5 inches 2 days ago.
Oh my goodness.
God.
In one day?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. Do you have flooding?
Yes.
Oh, man.
It finally got to where everything was dry again, and then we just got dumped on with 5 inches. 5 inches. The place is a swamp.
Oh my
Oh, that
goodness.
stinks. We had a lot of rain, but this is like for us it's normal. Like we've had some really, really heavy rainfall, but it's like our ground is built to absorb it. We're just like everything is just moss and clay. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we had an incredibly wet winter. We just kept getting rain all winter, which is abnormal for us. We usually get snow or just like a dry cold. And so we had rain all winter, so nothing ever dried out. And then we had rain for the first half of April. Well, I guess that's like now, right? The first week of April was pretty rainy, and now it's starting to we have like a dry week. I don't even want to say that. I need to knock on wood.
Knock on wood.
Yeah, quick.
Yeah.
I know. I'm so happy here when our drought season starts. All of the owners and barn owners, they're so happy when it rains, and it just makes me cry because I know what's coming. And then finally when the drought starts, I'm like, yes, please. All the grass needs to die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes all of the horses, they're very stiff right now when I work on them.
Oh.
That's actually such an interesting, I think like that's maybe something that if like, owners, caretakers, riders, whatever, it's a hard thing to like get your head around because I think we all like, I can relate having like this romantic notion of horses loving being on grass, and they like the taste, but I find like, horses are so much healthier in their bodies, easier to trim. The ones who I have the least trouble with consistently are horses that live in dry lots. And like,
live in dry lots.
Movement, so I have some horses on tracks or some horses who are, their dry lots are just relatively big and they're maximized so that, there's hay around and they can move around and they're worked enough. But like something to consider if you're a horse owner or a caretaker or like barn owner, manager, is a lot of those things that we see, that stiffness, that stickiness, that reluctance. These are horses who are in like, they're having like oxidative stress in their bodies. They're not comfortable. So we need to like expand our thoughts or change our thoughts on like what is actually healthy management for these critters. And I think that it's scary because sometimes you're like, what do I do with all these gorgeous fields?
Right.
But, just thinking of different ways to manage them is so important, and thinking of a different perspective on what creates a happy, healthy horse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that something that owners may not, I struggle with the thought with owners is that I want to press the idea that it's very rarely behavioral, like things that you're seeing with your horse in terms of riding under saddle or whatever. It's very rarely behavioral. So like I have owners that are like, oh, my horse is lazy. They're just always lazy. And I'm like, well, I wish I had known that the last year I've been trimming them, because they might be in pain with their feet,
Or it very well could be diet related.
Right.
I was thinking the other day when I was younger, I was at a boarding facility. All the horses ate oats and were turned out. Nobody ever had sore feet. So what's happening now? And I think it's all of the commercial feeds and the chemicals that go into them.
Yeah. And I mean, I shouldn't even comment on this because I don't know enough about it, but a friend of mine, Lisa Mittler, who might listen to this, she read a book called Restoring Eden, and I haven't read it yet, so I really can't speak to it specifically, but it talks a lot about like even the seeds that they're using to grow grass and crops and everything has like a pesticide built in. So it's not even like you can just get your own stuff and grow it and not spray the field. It's like, no, the actual seed has the what's repelling the bugs. So it's you could not spray it and say it's organic, but you already have that thing that's causing a problem.
The pesticides in it. Right. And I think that's causing systematic inflammation in our horses as well, because I just feel like they didn't have all these quite as, maybe we just didn't hear about it because we didn't have social media, but I don't remember this being such a big issue.
No, I mean, I don't either, but at the same time, there were plenty of, now looking back on it, not sound horses in our lesson program when I was growing up. And, but I don't know that I would have known that now, then.
Right.
But no, I don't remember as a kid any cases of founder laminitis at my barn. And we had like a 20 to 30 horse barn.
And half of them were probably on horse and mule sweet feed.
Right.
This
I know
for me, from 30 years ago. That's, boy, if you were on the good stuff, you were on the sweet feed.
Right. I know that they had sweet feed because as a kid, I used to chew on the little pieces of grain.
Yes, it's so yummy. But, we worked the dickens out of our horses too. So they worked out a lot of that issue,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is like just like the bias of our perspective, like I don't know that I'd be able to sort of retroactively recognize horses that were struggling with various, like, hoof issues in particular. I have no idea if like I can go back in time and be like, yes or no, but definitely there's been a ton of change in the way that we use horses. And like, we're certainly not doing them any favors by the way that we manage a lot of them. They're not worked, like you said, Kristen, working the bejesus out of a horse. There are not necessarily all positive implications, but it does certainly help our metabolic critters.
Especially when we would take them out, and trail ride for 4 hours as kids.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It was very good for them.
Right.
It really is. Yeah. There's a lot of horses that are sort of overfed and stalled, and then there they are with all this, I'm going to sound like a dummy if I tried to explain what processes are happening in their body, because I really don't know. But, they have all of this energy that they're, potential energy that's just sitting in their bodies that's not being used the way it's supposed to be used. So it just follows logically that it's going to create stress and discomfort if they're not at least moving and working it off.
Right. And honestly, this is kind of also pushing people that have been in the horse world for a while, I hope, because, I have people that tell me, well, I've been working, I've had horses for over 40, 50, whatever years, and this is how we've always done it. And maybe, or how they've always fed, like, oh, we always chuck the horses out in the field this time of year. Like, oh, we always fed this and that. But as we all mentioned, like, are those horses still being worked the same way they were 40 and 50 years ago? Like, are the fields really the same they were 40 and 50 years ago? I know that here we've had a lot more development, so there's a lot more horses and a lot less acreage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
So that kind of thing.
And what about the chemicals from the developments that come out,
Right. And there's so much we don't know. We just don't have those studies, So it's just, it's tough. So I think, something that we can kind of shift to too is that prevention is so much better than treatment and cure. Like we can prevent laminitis. We can prevent hoof issues before they start. But once the ball gets rolling, it's kind of like chasing a speeding train. Like you're trying to.
It's so hard to cut that inflammatory process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So obviously, like the easy way to say it is like, oh, pull your horse off grass this time of year. If there's any question of your horse having hoof issues right now, having any kind of soreness, that's typically an easy enough thing to rule out. Take them off the grass.
I have a lot of issues with that because then the only place for them to go is in the stall.
Yeah.
And then they suffer from no movement. So
having a hoof rehab facility, one main focus of ours is forage. I want the horses here to have safe, tested forage available 24/7 without the risk of becoming obese. I've spent years looking for the ideal slow feeder for us, and we have found it with Hay Boss feeders. When I tell you that my Hay Boss XL feeder has cut my feeding time by 90%, I mean it, and it might even be an understatement. The covered feeders with integrated slow feed nets allow for all my horses here to have access to hay all the time, which is healthy for their guts and minds. They're also not able to completely binge all at once, because the nets keep them in check. They're available all over North America right now. But side note, if you're in New England, I got mine from Mountain Lane Farm, who delivered it right to me and showed us how to set it up and use it. We can't imagine our lives without it here. We just had to take a brief break because my
technical difficulties.
So if everything sounds a little different, it could be because we just started at a new spot. Obviously, we can jump right back into. We talked about how like using a muzzle. It's hard because a lot of people have only grass turnout, and so a muzzle is like the best option.
And it's really rough too because some horses become very stressed when they wear muzzles. So then you have a cortisol release with that. Sometimes you just feel like you can't win with these guys. And we have Houdini horses who remove their muzzles, or their buddies who remove their muzzles.
Right. So I'm going to put a little plug in for building a track system if you have your own property.
Right. That's a great idea. But how much space do you really need? Can you build it on 2 acres?
Oh, yeah. So I have 2 tracks, and each are around about a 3-acre field. But I have an owner who has a track on like a 1/4 of an acre.
Oh, that's cool. Is it just
or maybe
around
a
the
half acre.
outside edge?
Yeah, around the outside edge. And then I have some who make a little maze so that even though it's like just an acre, they kind of like loop back and loop around so that they're utilizing the space, even though it's not a ton of like square footage.
Yeah, I have a client. They have a great little track system. I don't know how big her property is, so I'm not going to say it in case I accidentally offend you. Sorry, Lindsay. But a huge property. But she's used it really cleverly. So there's like a main track and there's little areas that, if horses need to be separated, they can go. But it's through the woods. It's kind of like the main bit is like around the outside of their outdoor riding ring. And because it's like they've left their trees in place, it's like a little bit more challenging terrain. So even if they're not moving like a crazy distance in terms of, like you said, square footage, they're like navigating different stuff and their hay is like spread out in nets throughout. So you can really maximize space. So if you do have your own property and the ability to like put up some temp fencing, you can do a lot with a small amount of area.
Yeah. Yeah, but I know the stress of only having grass turnout. I mean, I've been there too, boarded out barns with only grass turnout and just feeling such anxiety once I realized the symptoms of, grass related or diet related or metabolic related issues and feeling kind of helpless to know what to do about it. So obviously muzzles are one option. I am not a huge fan of stalling. I mean, my horses here live out 24/7. So I know that some people will say that's their only option. And that, I guess in terms of ruling out the hoof pain, if you only have grass turnout and the horse is sore and you're trying to figure out if it is the grass or not, maybe for like a temporary situation. But ultimately, I think that horses should be moving. So if that's the only option the barn has, you might have to, if it's not your own property, you might have to look at boarding somewhere else if that the land is killing your horse.
Well, this is like, it's frustrating. It's stressful. Like, I mean, I'm a boarder. I don't have my own property. And the idea of someone telling me, this thing that you maybe don't quite fully understand yet is actually hugely impactful and sorry, but you're going to have to move your horse. Like, it makes me, I get like hives because I love my boarding situation.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're an owner listening to this and you're starting to get hives and start panicking, the thing to do is like, okay, number one, dig breath. And then number two is, okay, like try to be a little systematic about it. I'm not a huge fan of extended stalling, but if your horse is really sore, a small, like you said, Alicia, a temporary short span of time where they're stalled and off grass, that's going to give you some information. And it's
usually very quick that they start to feel better as soon as they're taken off of the sugar.
Right. So like soak their hay and take them off grass and put them in a stall. It doesn't mean you can't go out and hand walk them, like you can go give them some exercise so they're not bored and not sitting there, but like implement that and get your vet out so that you can get some blood work done and like really see what you're dealing with. Do you have a true metabolic situation? Like what is actually happening? And then does it mean like you have to be more creative with your horse's turnout? Can they be turned out overnight when grass is a little bit less sugary? And if you have to move, it's really stressful, but is it more stressful than having a horse that's going to be sore for 6 months out of the year? Like in my books, not so much. Moving really stinks and it's hard, but if your horse is in pain, what's the point of boarding it anywhere?
Right.
It's hard and you really don't have much of a choice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wish there was an easier solution if that is truly the problem, but really it's like the environment has to change. And, obviously if you own your own property, then it, there's some very inexpensive ways to, make that work. Or not, I shouldn't say very, everything with owning a property costs something, but
I could tell as you were saying that you were just thinking about the year being like, never mind, it's not that expensive.
Yeah, right. But I mean, there's ways to do it that are budget friendly. But boarding is where I know for sure it is definitely tricky. And I've had people tell me, well, this is the best boarding barn within an hour radius. And I understand like that is a very hard situation. And,
it becomes very difficult with diet as well, because a lot of times you don't have a choice. You have to feed what the barn feeds.
Yeah.
And so usually with that, I at least try to get them on a copper zinc blend.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
In the least, that's what you can add as a supplement if you can't control the actual bulk feed that they receive.
Right. I think it's really tough. But if you're in this situation and you're feeling like, oh my God, what do I do? There are steps you can take. Try and identify what's going on. Can you be creative? Experiment with muzzles. When I heard of a muzzle, the only experience I had with seeing them was those like metal basket muzzles, or the ones that are like woven nylon and have like one little hole in them, and it looks awesome.
The really heavy ones with the rubber bottom that are nylon. Yeah.
But there are some really, really nice muzzles on the market now. Like, I haven't had a horse yet that doesn't manage the green guard muzzle really well.
Is that the plastic square one?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a really nice muzzle.
And then the thin line one is also really nice. And like, this is not an endorsement. I make no money off it. I just like them.
Right.
I think it's called the flexible Philly one.
Yeah, that's the one I usually recommend because I've seen horses use it well.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the flexible Philly.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to look that up.
So, because if your horse is like truly metabolic and like cannot be on grass, well, that's one thing. But there are plenty of horses who are going to be a bit more sensitive. Like my own horse, I ran a full metabolic panel on him within the last few months. He's fine. He was really struggling last summer. I think, Kristen, because like you, our area had some unprecedented climate and weather stuff. And so he was feeling like kind of footsore and cranky, but I'm on grass differently, and he's at a boarding barn, and it worked out. And if that didn't work out, then my next step would have been, okay, can he be out on grass, limited by a muzzle? Like, what can we do? Just, there are ways that you can get creative without like turning your whole world upside down.
Exactly. Yeah. And something that, I know a lot of owners reach out and say, well, what supplement can I give my horses to not struggle with grass? And really, truly, there is nothing that is going to halt that. Like, you really, owners would say, oh, my horse is on metformin so they can be on grass. And that's not the case.
That's not how.
You can't, anything that's going to be visually removing that pain is typically something it's not going to be stopping the actual inflammatory process. So,
that's a really good.
Yeah. So you want to remove the trigger. I think that a lot of owners just want something that they can give them. And, unfortunately,
we'd all love that.
Right.
But it's just like, it's making us feel better because we don't see the disease process going on, but it's still happening in there. It's not good.
Right. Exactly. So, yeah, even there's some amazing for metabolic horses, some amazing new medications that are coming out. I've done a podcast episode on the SGLT2 inhibitors that have really saved lives and on some horses I work on. But Dr. Kellen, who,
is it on the market now?
Well, I don't know if it's for horses, but my clients are getting it. I think they're still buying it as like the human drug through the vet. But, Dr. Kellen, who works with started ECIR, said that, and I agree, you need to still address the root cause. You can't just put them on something like that and let them run wild in a field,
Right.
Yeah.
It's still like a lifestyle management issue that comes down to just addressing, like you said, addressing the root cause. That's really the best way of putting it.
Right. Yeah. And obviously this is like a super random side note because we spent so much time talking about spring and spring grass changes. So in the fall, obviously people are like, oh, well, they're not getting like fresh, lush grass in the fall. And typically the issues that I see or that we all see in the fall are because the temperatures at night are below, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but then it's sunny and beautiful during the day. And that will cause the grass to just spike in sugar because it's not utilizing the sugar overnight to grow. It's the cold temperatures.
That's exactly what our weather is doing right now. We're getting dumped with rain. It was in the 40s last night, and now it's in the 80s.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And we've had several days of that.
Yeah. And so that can be, I guess, spring and fall. I guess, that's true for here right now too. I tend to think less about it now that my horses aren't on grass.
Yeah. I think, if we're thinking about this from an owner perspective too, like danger zones for weather are like big temperature swings, anything that's going to, you don't have to be, I'm certainly not like a botanist. I really don't know very much about plants, but you can imagine that if it's your little grass growing outside, big swings in temperature from day to night are going to impact how a plant grows. And we all know, I was just about to say something that I don't know is true, but I'm pretty sure all plants use sugar. they're doing like chlorophyll things. They're photosynthesizing.
Disclaimer,
anyway.
none of us are scientists.
Yeah. Kristen kind of is a scientist.
Oh, yeah.
But spring, fall, where you're having like usually cooler nights, warmer days, those are times to be watchful of your horses, because this can like all impact horses that aren't clinically metabolic or horses that don't have like acute episodes, which is maybe something, I don't know, maybe we could talk about that a bit. I found one thing that I found really interesting in like my own journey and education into hoof care, and that I find is like eye-opening to a lot of clients, is trying to expand that definition of like what laminitis is, because I think we all know, okay, laminitis, really bad, really scary, rotation, all of this stuff. But laminitis is actually like a much broader thing than that. Like a lot of just sort of subclinical or barely clinical hoof pain is in fact laminitis.
Right.
Yes. It's so tough, and they are afraid of the term, but
Yeah.
an itis is inflammation and lamina. So it's just inflammation of the lamina. You don't have to have rotation, and it can come and go quickly.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so I think that can kind of take some of the sting out of it. I hope it does. And I've said this to people a lot. I mean, I think that I can remember in the last couple of weeks saying to someone, like, I'm going to say a word and I think you're going to have a little freak out. And so that's okay. And we can have that freak out together. But I want you to know that, like, I'm not scared of it, but this is what's happening. Like,
yeah,
it's laminar issues. So I hope it can like kind of both take the big scary sting out of it, but also allow us to realize that we need to be really serious if we're seeing like footiness, foot soreness, stickiness, something that might present as stiffness, because it's often bilateral. We often don't see this present as like limping or a gait asymmetry. They're just kind of shuffly or slower or quote unquote lazy. But we need to dial it a little deeper.
Because they're evenly sore on every foot.
Exactly.
So they remain looking sound.
Something I will say, because obviously I focus so much on navicular cases, is that when I have a horse that has a primary hoof that was their kind of quote unquote more lame navicular hoof, and they're doing really well, spring grass comes up, they nibble it, they get sore on their navicular hoof. A lot of times the owner's like, oh, well, it's just their navicular. And I want to say that, yes, obviously that is their weaker hoof. So you're going to see issues in that first when there's inflammation. Sure. So I have owners say like, well, it's not the grass, it's just because that's their navicular foot. But something that Dr. Alicia Nolfi said on a previous episode, a laminitis episode that we did on the podcast, was assume all lameness is laminitis until proven otherwise.
So smart, right? Like there's not that much soft tissue there. Like if something is inflamed, there's a pretty good chance it's a lamina,
right. And if it's a weak foot, then that foot is going to revert back to where it was,
right. Or if you start to, okay, so it's a horse that has had navicular issues, back of the foot problems. So they start to have some front of the foot problems. They overload the back of their foot. They don't have like that strong of a back of the foot. So it shouldn't surprise us that when that happens, their, navicular issues, their caudal foot issues start to flare up, because maybe it's just even if they've reached some stability, some equilibrium, some comfort, maybe they can't overload it. I mean, we've all seen those chronically laminitic feet that have gorgeous caudal feet on them because they're so well developed from being overloaded.
Right.
Yeah. And those navicular horses, they just get in a bad cycle because the heel becomes sore. Then they start toe first landings, and they're having inflammation of the corium there at the front, and the lamina are inflamed, and they can't get into a comfortable position with their feet at all. Right. So then you have compensation, standing goat on a rock. Then the entire body is involved. All the muscles become sore. You end up having hoof capsule distortion changes, and it's just huge.
Well, and then it goes
effect
everywhere, right? It's like their guts are messed up because it's toxemia, and then their stance is impacting their dentition, and it can really snowball. So for all of me saying it should take the sting out of it, like maybe it shouldn't, because it's pretty serious stuff.
Their dentition.
What?
That was a good one. Their dentition.
Their dentition. I thank you so much. I was just spitting that out. But I guess it's more, it should sting maybe, but just really being able to look at trying to be objective, trying to take yourself out of what scares you about the word laminitis. Traditionally, that's not what you're going to hear. If you've grown up in the traditional kind of horse world, people are going to think of laminitis as the horse's bone rotated and sank through its foot. And that'll happen in real bad cases. But there is mild subclinical or kind of quasi-clinical laminitis all the time, everywhere. It's all around you. Changes in their environment, changes in their like hormonal status, these kinds of things that we can see. Feet that are, like you said, like just kind of on the edge, teetering is I think the word you used. Like we start to see them struggle, which brings me, I think, maybe like brings me as though I'm building to some thesis, but this makes me think of like, you know, I think we've all heard some vets or like other folks say like, it's the degree of rotation that determines the prognosis for a laminitis case. And really, I think at this point, we know a little bit more factually that it's actually the health of the foot at the time of the insult, right? The state and health and strength of the foot is what informs how well a horse is going to be able to deal with a laminitic event.
They have to have a really strong caudal foot. And, you know, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for the type of discomfort the horse feels. You could have a horse that rotates a lot and he's just out, you know, scuttering around with no problem. Or you have a horse that is rotated just a tiny bit and cannot walk.
Or a horse that isn't even rotated and can't walk.
Right.
Yeah, right.
I work on a mare. I just started working on her and her feet were alarming, frankly. When I saw them, I was like, oh dear, you know, big elf slipper, curled up, continued inflammation, hoof rings, crazy. And it's like, okay, well, this is, you know, okay, this is going to be a project. And then before I was waiting for the vet to come so we could take rods and get to work together. And the horse was just turned out in the indoor, which granted has, you know, pretty soft footing, but she was trotting, she was cantering, she's like scooting around. Her feet looked horrendous. She was so rotated. She had like a little nub of a bone in one foot and she's just like, this is fine. Mm-hmm. And then like you say,
she probably had nerve damage. Yeah.
Probably.
So sadly. Any feeling.
Yeah. Well, maybe a blessing in disguise, right?
Yeah.
So, but it really like, I think we can get stuck. And I know in my area, I've had issues of maybe disagreeing a little bit with a veterinary practitioner of whether something is or is not laminitis because they take a radiograph and they're like, well, there isn't rotation. I'm going, well, I don't know if I care that much. And like, or there's like a teeny bit of slight capsular rotation, but we're not going to count it as laminitis. I'm going, well, like it is though. Like,
right.
It is. And we need to treat it that way.
Right. And, you know, Dr. Van Epp said that now, I don't know if they've published the research yet, but he said you can basically say that if the corium, or sorry, I should say, if the HL zone on radiographs is thicker than 8 millimeters, then you can say that horse is acutely laminitic based on their research. Yeah. So, you know, I think that we kind of have to move away from like, oh, there's no rotation or there is rotation.
Right.
And obviously we know too that the time of the radiographs, it's not like everything has stopped and it's all hunky-dory. Like things are still happening.
Not like the X-ray beam stops the rotation or stops the disease process.
Like things can happen after that is taken. So I've had people contact me and be like, well, they're not rotated. I'm like, well, how old are those radiographs? You know?
Right. And they're like 6 months, a year old. You're like, oh, you know.
Or I love it when people are like, well, my horse isn't metabolic. When did you last test him? 4 years ago. Okay, well, 4 years ago, maybe they didn't have PPID or it was so early that it wasn't coming up, you know?
I think this is a really good point where you are, Alicia, is to insert that all horses, once they hit double digits, every owner should have a baseline metabolic profile done.
Absolutely.
100%.
It's
to have it on file. And maybe you don't need it at that moment, but you might. And it's the same with radiographs. Every year, if you have a horse that's completely fine, still get hoof radiographs every year because there may be a moment when that horse is not fine. And how many times do we go in on foundered cases and it would be very helpful for us when we're doing realignment trims to know what the foot looks like when it's healthy.
Yeah,
totally. Yeah, totally. Or to know, like,
owners
this
never
horse had
have
that
those.
navicular cyst, and it was sound for 6 years with that navicular cyst. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that it's causing a problem. And that might be like a bad example, but
no, I think that's a great example.
There are so many horses with, you know, navicular bone changes that may have at one point caused them pain, but perhaps they've rehabbed from it, perhaps whatever, their hoof balance changed and they're managing fine with it. And it's one of those things I think where you look at it. And I'm like, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm dragging vets. They have to come up with a diagnostic. And I think when you see those bony changes on navicular bone, you're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's probably what's going on. And like to your point, Kristen, if we can say, well, no, that horse had those changes last year and he was totally fine. I think that gives a little more ammunition and just be able to, and it helps our vets to be like, oh, okay, well then maybe not. Maybe let's look somewhere else.
Right. We have to have radiographs to compare to. It makes everything so much easier.
Yeah,
it really does. And to our wonderful vets listening, if there are any, I have some good veterinary friends who have been like offering yearly rads as like part of the package. And like the uptake on them has been really, really good. So just something to consider.
I have an amazing vet up here who, if you haul in, she'll do stereo radiographs for $20. Take the picture. It's just a lateral. She doesn't do any diagnosis with it. And it comes to me or it comes to whoever. And that's amazing. Awesome. And also, don't forget to do laterals of hind feet. Hind feet are great as well. We need to see the hind feet.
Can't ignore the hinds.
If the hinds are trashed, most likely we know that the front feet really are sore.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for those who are kind of confused, we're talking about getting radiographs and getting blood work. ECIRhorse.org is a really great resource for figuring out, what should I ask my veterinarian for blood work? Like, what are they looking for on radiographs? And also, I know that we spent a while talking about grass and how to mitigate issues from grass for the places that only have grass turnout. And I didn't think of it at the time, but safergrass.org is another really good website.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's Katie Watt's website, right?
Yes,
Katie,
exactly.
Kathy? Shoot.
I think it's Katie.
Okay. Sorry, Katie/Kathy. Yeah, no, that's a great website.
Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, I feel like we covered a lot of topics and I'll like splice these two together, but I know. If anybody has any questions, there's probably many, so contact us.
Well, yes, ask the questions and we'll reconvene and we'll answer the questions.
I think that's a good idea.
Yes, totally. We could do like a little AMA about spring grass. It would be helpful. We could do a Dear Abby column, but podcast.
Exactly. I know. Maybe I'll put that in the post and say, if you have questions, because we buzzed through so many things, please comment.
And the other thing too, one thing to say to owners when you think about if you're an owner is that while this can be super overwhelming, like any issue your horse is having can be really frustrating and upsetting and overwhelming. The nice thing about this particular issue is you are maybe more in control of it than you are for other like hoof related issues for your horse. This is something that potentially you can really solve if say you don't have a hoof care provider who's on board with this way of thinking, or maybe they disagree with you. Well, you can just change the diet or change something about the environment, and worst case scenarios, they're probably going to thank you because you've made their job easier by making the hoof a little bit better quality, maybe making your horse stand a little bit better because they're more comfortable. Like, you do have a lot of control over this as an owner, that's kind of a nice place to be.
Absolutely.
If we can end on like an up note.
Yeah. Yeah. So as kind of like doom and gloom as we have been on some of these topics, there's so much that we can do to prevent or to help once we realize there's a problem,
Totally.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to chime in with?
Yeah, no, this was super, super helpful. I think good for us as hoof care providers too, to just have it in our brains as we enter the combat zone this spring.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both so much for being willing to do this so last minute. So for those listening, I literally asked them like 2 hours ago if they would hop on a call because this needs to publish in a few days. So you guys did awesome.
Anytime. Anything for you.
Thanks. All right, cool. Well, I hope you all have nice weather the rest of this week and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's supposed to rain for 3 days here.
Oh, no.
I'll have whatever you have, Alicia, just like 2 days later. So
I know. Oh, man. I don't even know. I stopped looking. It gives me anxiety.
Well, fingers crossed for all of us.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.
See you later. I always say that I'm slightly more hoof obsessed than the average person, and chances are, if you're listening to a hoof care podcast, you are too. So we should probably be friends. Feel free to find me on Facebook or email me at thehumblehoof@gmail.com.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.